Good morning, noon, and night, everyone. This is the Weis Choice Podcast, and I want to thank you all for making the wise choice and listening in today. Today's discussion is going to be a little more casual than some of the conversations we've had recently. Obviously, our last episode was dealing with the world events of what's going on right now with Russia and their actions in Ukraine. Prior to that, we had discussed my journey in the education industry, getting started with substitute teaching, going to school for my bachelor's degree so I can be a teacher, and some of my experiences with that up to this point. But today I'm going to do something that we haven't done yet. So I'm actually going to review and kind of break down some of my thoughts on an audiobook that I listened to recently. I was recently introduced to the story The Hanging Stranger by Philip K. Dick, and I found it really fascinating. There's definitely some core elements to the story and parts of the ending that I'm really excited to talk to you guys about. But there were some themes that were discussed but while not wholly relevant to our current situation in this country and the world and all the turmoil that we've seen post-COVID, I do think there's some interesting conversations that can be had, maybe some not pure parallels, but some lessons that can be learned from the story that I think, at the very least, definitely some things that can be extrapolated out to a broader context of relevancy. So as I mentioned, the name of the story is The Hanging Stranger, and it is authored by Philip K. Dick. I was able to find a version of this story for free on YouTube in audiobook format. There are several different versions of the audiobook, it seems like, because I saw some of the links in YouTube are like 30 minutes. Some of them are like 37 minutes, a little shy of 40 minutes. So there's several different iterations of that on YouTube. You can find it with different speakers, different lengths of the audiobook, but essentially the same story. And so I wanted to get into that with you guys and discuss my thoughts on some of the story. There are some themes that I feel like not perfect parallels, but I do think there are some lessons and some themes that can be, at the very least, extrapolated out to a broader context. So I'm excited to get into this story with you guys. As I said, this is the first time that we're reviewing an audiobook, and I would love to get suggestions from the audience as far as any books, any stories, audiobooks. It doesn't matter what format it is. Doesn't matter whether it's fiction or nonfiction, but you guys will see that this is fiction, dystopian, sci-fi, which is a genre that I am fond of, but I found that this story has some themes that really stuck out to me. So we're going to get into that. As always, I hope you guys enjoy, and thank you again for listening. All right, so I know that I had mentioned that the format that I found this story in was an audiobook on YouTube, and I rather enjoyed that. I'm not necessarily the hugest fan of audiobooks because I find that I personally follow along and retain the information that I'm trying to take in much better when I read along physically. But I still enjoy audiobooks when you find a really good speaker that has a really good voice, that sets the tone, that builds a good atmosphere for the story, that's able to apply different tones and voices to the characters without sounding awkward or forced or anything like that. A good audiobook can be a really great experience, and I think it definitely adds to the experience in its own way. Now, that's not to say, as I said, there's some of us, if you're a visual person, if you're a visual learner, there might be things that you don't get out of the audiobook, or it might be more difficult to hold focus. So I do understand that, and I did experience that even at times with this audiobook. But you have plenty of different formats, and I was able to find this one on YouTube. I'm pretty sure I was just kind of looking for I was kind of bored and I was looking for some entertainment. Obviously, you guys know I love listening to podcasts. Part of the reason why I started this one. But I also like listening to audiobooks from time to time. And so I think I was looking for Lovecraftian fiction. Ended up stumbling upon this, and I really enjoyed the story, especially one of the twists that you guys see at the ending, because I think, one of my favorite things with the story is seeing themes that tie through all the way end, and maybe something that's referenced at the beginning that we can probably tell is important, but we're not necessarily made to know exactly what context this piece of the story is going to be relevant. We don't necessarily know the impact. We may not know the character behind it or their motivations, whatever it is. So one of the things that I thought was successful with this story that you guys will see is you get certain parts of the story delivered in the very beginning. It's very emphatic. I think the beginning does a great job of hooking people in. And then there's certain parts of the story from the beginning that don't really come back until the very end. And I think that is really done very successfully. So regarding the story itself, I'm going to give my best version of a brief summary of the story. So that way, there will be spoiler alerts, obviously. We are going to have to discuss the ending. We're going to have to discuss certain spoilers. So with that said, now's the time to let you know there's a spoiler alert. If you want to listen to this story and come back and then listen to this, go find it on YouTube. Go pick up, wherever you can find a version of it. Go check it out. But with that said, we are going to get into spoiler territory. So as I mentioned, this is a dystopian sci-fi, so we are set in some kind of town, some kind of city, and we meet the main character. His name is Ed Loyce. And the story opens up, he's working in his basement. He's been trying to move dirt from his basement to his backyard. He's doing construction work, house renovations, and things like that. I believe they mentioned that, it's hard work, but he wants to save the money, and with the money, he can get his wife a nice gift and stuff like that. So we get to meet the character, hardworking, honest man, all that type of stuff. We see when Mr. Loyce is done working that he gets in his car and he goes to his store downtown. So he has a shop front that he owns. And on his way down to the store, as he's driving down the street, he passes, I believe it's a park, and he sees something hanging from a lamppost in the park. And he's very confused by this. And most of the people in the town are going about their days. So he drives by it, he turns around, he tries to get a look at it again, and this is when he realizes that what's hanging from the lamppost is actually a human body. And this is where he starts to get incredibly disturbed, because obviously, at first, he just sees this weird thing hanging from a lamppost, and it's like, okay, what is that? It's very peculiar, and no one's seeming to pay it any mind, and then he notices it's a body. And so when he notices that it's a body, he starts freaking out, and he's like, oh my God, why is no one doing anything about this? So Mr. Loyce turns around, he gets out of his car, and he goes to look at the body. And eventually one of his employees from his store comes out. Some of the other shop owners come out, and Mr. Loyce is turning to them, and he's saying, guys, like, what's going on? What's with this body? Have you guys seen this? And one of his employees says, yeah, I saw it. What about it? I went and grabbed a coffee and came back. Another person, he's saying, well, what about the cops? Has anyone called the cops? And they're saying, well, I mean, come on. If there's a body, the cops got to know about it, right? Everyone's dismissing what is very obviously a major event. I mean, a body hanging from a lamppost. Obviously, even doesn't matter what era you're from, what decade you're from, that's going to be, a sight to see and not a very nice one. So Mr. Loyce is reasonably freaking out, and he's obviously reacting to this very strongly. And part of his strong reaction is in part a reaction to the non-reaction of all the people around him, especially when I believe it's his employee that turns around and goes back into the store and makes a comment like, oh, got to get back to work, business before pleasure, as if Ed Loyce is sitting there and just like wasting time and fooling around looking at this body. So Loyce freaks out, and I'm pretty sure he ends up getting a hold of the cops or whatever happens, and the cops show up. So once the cops shows up, he starts talking to him. He's trying to tell him all about it. And the cops, again, just like everyone else, are incredibly dismissive, And so he's trying to tell them what's going on. And there's a body in this, and I noticed. And they cut him off. And name, address, just collecting questions, just almost not even worried about what he's talking about. And so he starts asking them questions. What's going on? I mean, like, what's happening here? And they ask him, what were you doing today? The cops turn to him. They're not interested in the body. They just want to know, what were you doing today? So they ask him what he was doing today, and he tells them he was working in the basement, he was getting things done, and he was busy all day. And then, he starts to ask, he's like, did I miss something? Because everyone seems to not be bothered by the body. Was there an explanation or something? Did I miss that? And the cops look at each other, and then they go, yeah, that's right. You missed the explanation. And at this point, even though, we don't see it yet, the story doesn't tell us explicitly, but this is where, if not before, Ed Loyce starts to question what exactly is going on, even on a deeper level, because now the cops are acting shady. The cops start acting shady, and Loyce tries to escape. So Loyce escapes from the cops, He starts to get away. We even start to, hear him questions. He says, they weren't real cops. I've owned a storefront in this town for how many years? I know every cop in town. If these were cops, I would have known them. So who were they? He doesn't know. So already we have some kind of issue there. We have fake cops. We don't really know what that's about. He also mentions, he says, what explanation? Like, there's no explanation. No one got an explanation because when he went out and talked to the body, all the other storefront people and the people in the area, even though they didn't react to the body, they also didn't seem to know what it was about. I mean, when he said something about what about the cops, call the cops, one of the other storefront owners said, well, but, I mean, they know about it, right? So they didn't seem to know. They didn't have an explanation. If there was some kind of secret explanation, why didn't they say that in the moment instead of saying, nah, well, the cops must know? So Loyce starts to put these dots together, and he escapes from the cops, and and he's starting to want to figure out what is going on and understanding that there's something much deeper than just a body hanging from the lamppost. So he goes on, he escapes from the cops, and he's traveling through the town, and eventually he gets to, I believe it's the police station and over by the city hall. And this is where he sees, because this whole time he's contemplating, we hear his inner thoughts, and he's like, what's going on? And he starts connecting these dots. But it's as he's traveling through the city and thinking about these things, and then he gets to City Hall, and he says what he sees is like some dark mass. It almost looks like a cloud, and then we end up seeing that what it really is like a swarm of these insect-like creatures. And at this point, what was just peculiar behavior by the humans is now something completely else. This is now he begins to ponder alien invasions and forces from another dimension, all these things, because now he is seeing non-human creatures swarming, and just like the body that was hanging from the lamppost. Just like the body that was hanging from the lamppost, nobody seems to notice these things. He seems to be the only one that is pertinent to the actions around him by these bug-like creatures, the body hanging and everything like that. So at this point, he starts to believe in some kind of greater conspiracy because obviously, we had the peculiar behavior, but now we have some kind of potentially extraterrestrial force. So he sees some kind of major event going on around him, and obviously no one seems privy to it. No one seems to care. Everyone dismisses him. Everyone, the storefront owners were telling him he sounded sick, asking him if he was okay, if he had been drinking. So he finds himself in the middle of this giant conspiracy. You got aliens, you got people ignoring dead bodies and everything like that. And so he tries to make his way home. And during his travels, he continues to think about this conspiracy and what exactly is going on. And he mentions, obviously they're not omnipotent. These aren't gods, even if they are aliens. They're not perfect because they managed to miss him. So he being in his basement, he obviously missed whether it's an indoctrination ceremony. I believe that around the City Hall moment, he notices that they have some kind of mimicry ability where they have the ability to shapeshift, essentially. So he begins to realize the depths of the situation that he's in. And in his travels, he comes across other human beings where he notices these two guys, I believe, on the bus that make some sort of eye contact, and one of the guys is watching him. And Loyce doesn't know whether or not, he's questioning. He says, are these more people like him? Are they more free-minded people? Are they not caught and captured, or are they undercover and looking for him? Are they one of them? Are they one of the shape-shifting creatures that's secretly looking for him? So he's going through this whole crisis, and he's on his way home, and eventually he finally makes it home. And he gets to his house, and he locks the door, he grabs a knife, and he finds his wife, and he's like, "Are you alone? Is anyone else here?" And his wife is freaking out. His wife is confused. "What's going on, Ed? I don't understand what's going on." Yes, we're the only ones here. It's just us and the boys. The twins are upstairs. And again, he locks the door. He closes all the blinds. He's looking out for anything that might be a threat, because now he knows, obviously, he had escaped from the cops. He had seen the fly people at City Hall. He didn't know if the people on the bus were potential moles looking for him, or if they were other escapees. So he feels threatened. He feels like he's on the run. He feels like they might be on his tail, looking for him, trying to capture him and put him under the mind control that everyone else seems to be. But so anyway, so he's talking to his wife, and he's trying to, get her to pack up the stuff, get the boys so they can get out of there. And as they're talking, as he's explaining what's going on, the boys start to come out of the room. They're like, "What's going on, Dad? Like, I was doing homework." And he's like, "You can forget about algebra," or whatever he says. And he starts collecting them, and like they're getting ready to get out of there. And then he hears it. He hears the buzz. He hears the buzz. He hears the same buzz that he heard when he was at City Hall. So he knows that one of these creatures is nearby. And he starts to freak out. I think they say he drops to the ground. He grabs his knife. He's ready to defend himself and his family. But unfortunately, the insect creature that was nearby was actually posing as one of his sons. So this bug creature, it flies at him. He stabs him. He tries to protect himself, and eventually he does. And then he notices this mass on the ground that's withering, wilting, whatever it is, and it has the same yellow shirt, the same jeans that his son was wearing, and he realizes even his family is compromised. But at this point, he can't stick around. At this point, he understands just how dire the situation is, and he has to leave his family behind. He tries not to think about the fact that he just killed his son, or he just killed some shapeshifter. So he leaves. He leaves his family, and he continues to escape the town, to try to find some safe area, trying to find people that aren't yet infected so that they can collectivize, so that they can do something about this. As we mentioned earlier, obviously they weren't perfect. They managed to not capture him. He had managed to evade them with the police in the back of the police car. He had managed to evade them at City Hall. He had managed to evade them on the city bus, and he had managed to evade them when they attacked him as his own son. So they obviously weren't perfect beings. He was hoping to find people that weren't yet captured by this mind virus, by these bug-like shapeshifter aliens. And he keeps looking, he keeps traveling. Eventually he gets to a gas station either at the edge of town or just out of town. And he finds a gas station clerk that seems to be a normal person, and he pleads with him. He asks them. He tells them everything that's happened. He tells them about the infection of the town. He tells them about the infiltration. He tells them about people not caring about the body hanging from the lamppost and everything, all the weird things that are going on in the conspiracy. And the gas station clerk, he's hesitant. He doesn't really know how to feel about it. But we get a flash forward, and we see that he does in fact take him to this community, and he takes him to a police station where he speaks with the commissioner of another town, and he tells them. And he tells them everything that he thinks is going on. And he tells them about his ideas of this conspiracy and how he believes the town was taken over, and how he believes these creatures have infiltrated the towns and start at the highest level of authority in the cities, whether it be the police stations or at the city hall. And they infect throughout the town, and it is only once they have a complete control over a town do they then move to the next town. And he talks about how he was able to get away, and obviously these creatures aren't infallible. And he goes through all of these thoughts and these strategies and these questions that he has. And he mentions the two men on the bus that he wasn't sure if they were infiltrators themselves or whether they were like him. And eventually the police commissioner listens to him, and he says, "Well, it sounds like you've got it all figured out." And Loyce says, "Well, not quite exactly." He says, what I can't figure out is the body. I can't figure out why the hanging body was there. Obviously he understands why people didn't react to it if they were under the mind control of the bug. But he says, what I don't understand is why there was a body hanging from the lamppost. And the commissioner turns to him, and with a dark smirk that sends chills down Loyce's spine, he says, "Well, that should be obvious, isn't it? It's bait." And it is at this point that Loyce begins to realize exactly what situation he is in. Because the commissioner recognizes what Loyce pointed out, which is that, yes, the mind control wasn't perfect. There are people that slip through the cracks. And so the significance of the hanging body is, if you have the populace under mind control, by putting something so outrageous and so blatant in a public setting, you force people who are not under mind control to bring attention to themselves and to point out, does anybody else see what is going on here? And that is exactly what Loyce did. He freaked out. He made a scene. He brought attention to himself and every single person around him. They made him feel crazy. Are you all right, Ed? Are you drunk? But that only made him more and more convinced that something was going on and that he needed to get to the root to it and that he needed to unknowingly expose himself. And so the reality of his fate begins to set in for Ed Loyce. And you see him chilled to the bone as the commissioner stands up and says, "Come along now," and leads him out the door, outside of the police station, where other cops were waiting, next to a street lamp with the rope in hand. But the story doesn't quite fade to black there. We fast forward a little bit and we meet a new man. And he's getting ready for work and he's on his way to start his day. And as he's driving through the town, he notices something. Something hanging from the lamppost from outside the police station. And as he gets closer, he realizes it's a body of a man from out of town that no one seems to recognize and no one seems to pay any attention to. So we see that this story will inevitably continue, that the cycle will live on, and that this new man will essentially take the place of an Ed Loyce who, for whatever reason, missed his indoctrination, did not become subject to the bug alien invasion. But ultimately, we know where this story will go. He will make a scene, he will point out the body. People will notice that more than they'll notice the body, and eventually he will be found. So regarding my overall reaction to the story, there were a lot of things that I really liked about it. What I feel like the intro does really well is that obviously what an intro should do is it should get you interested in the story. And I feel like there's two aspects of the intro that do a really great job of getting you hooked in, right? So the first part is the hanging body. And you ask yourself, okay, why is there a hanging body? So there's the conflict of how did the body get there and wanting the answers to that question. That's the first thing we're introduced to, right? Is the body is there, it captures your attention. Why is it there? We naturally have these questions that come to us. And the great thing that the author does is Ed Loyce kind of is a stand-in for the audience because he asks the same questions that an audience or a reader would naturally ask. So he sees the body, why is the body there? Then he starts to notice that no one seems to care that the body is there. And of course, the reader is naturally going to ask, why does no one seem to care that the body is there? So I think the introduction of the story not only does a good job setting the capture for immersion, for wanting to get you interested in the story, I think it also it establishes a basic world logic that is not far removed from our own world logic. But there has to be something to care about, right? And obviously the conflict is what gets us to care about. But when we have characters that we can relate to or that ask the same questions that we would ask, I think it puts the audience in a stronger position of being in the story and feeling a part of the story and having emotional investment because now they can anchor themselves to a character that they see themselves in because that character is asking the questions that I would ask. That question is reacting to these things the way that I would react. They're feeling the emotions I would feel. I would be confused. I would be disgusted by the lack of action of the people around me. I would be having, who wouldn't be full of emotional distress in that moment? So the beginning of the story does a really great job of getting us to care and also giving us a character to anchor onto that we can kind of see the story through our lens, in the lens of the character in the story. So I think all of that is really strong. We start to get some of the other side characters, and I feel like these side characters are introduced pretty well. Some of them have we see little bits of their personality as far as when the employee mentions about him feeling unwell and being drunk. There's a certain level of obviously comfortability with the Ed Loyce character. These people are obviously very familiar with him. They feel comfortable with him. They feel obviously even though he's unwell, they're obviously close enough with him to kind of joke with him, and who knows how much of that is the influence of the bugs and the mind control and everything like that. But assuming the only peculiarity is their lack of interest in the body and the rest of their personality is more or less in line with who they would be, I feel like the side characters, even if they're only introduced for like a few moments, are still fleshed out as realistic enough human beings, even in a mind control state. So the first act of the story, I feel, is really successful in a lot of the things that a first act needs to be. We get an introduction to the world and to our characters. We have a reason to care about the character. We can see ourselves in them, and it gives a perspective of the audience. We have a conflict. We have a reason to be invested, a question that we want to know an answer to, things like that. The side characters that are introduced, they don't bog down the story, but they're told in a way that is realistic, and that's all around specifically the hanging stranger. So once he gets away from the cops, the micro conflict stops being about the hanging stranger. Up to that point, it was mostly about the body hanging and the peculiarity of everyone's behavior. Once he escapes the cops, his focus quickly fixates on specifically what is going on with everyone's behavior. Because again, we have the fake cops, we have the fake explanation. So now the first act is mostly focused about why is the body here and why does no one care? And as you move into the second act, we see the focus and the motivation of Loyce change around uncovering the conspiracy, and eventually, once he gets to the point of getting to his family, the third act is him trying to find people to break down the conspiracy. So first act, pretty good. Don't really have any complaints about that. I feel like it was successful where it needed to be, so no complaints there. The second act, I don't feel as strongly about. I don't have anything that I feel strongly negative about, but my main criticism, I feel like, with the middle part of the story, first off, I'll be honest. In the audiobook, this is the part where I kind of not necessarily lose interest, but basically after the city hall, like after the revelation of the bug creatures, there is a significant lull in the story where a lot of it is just Loyce's inner thoughts. And I do have a slight criticism that I feel like because this story is so plot-driven, because everything's about what's going on in the community, everything's about Loyce is reacting to everything. Loyce is a very reactive protagonist. So I just question what it does for the pacing mostly, because the first act of the story has a fairly good, very steady pacing. We get introduced to the conflict. We have questions arising when they should be asked, and characters reacting to those thoughts in the moment in a realistic manner. And it's not that what happens in Act 2 isn't realistic. I just think that Act 1 and Act 3 are very centered around external stimuli and Loyce's choices to those realities. The only time that I feel like that is true for Act 2 is when he first sees the city hall and he starts to piece it together. That is obviously him reacting to an external stimuli. But then he goes internal with his thoughts for a while. He starts thinking about the conspiracy. Are the people on the bus real people? Are they shapeshifters? All of that. But it's not until he gets back to his family and he has to confront the shapeshifter son that I feel like things kind of get back to a steady pace of storytelling. So not a huge criticism. I just feel like Act 2 was a little inconsistent with the pacing. I don't think the one thing I will say is I don't think this story has very much fat. Like, I don't think that Act 2 needs to be trimmed down. And I do like that in the beginning we have the old world order, everything is normal. We have the introduction of the conflict where he sees that people, are not acting normal and the body is there. We start to have the rising action as he sees the city hall and he is introduced to, the face of the threat, essentially. But I feel like his character conflict arc happens with his wife and his family because essentially he's very passive and very, or not necessarily passive, but he's very reactive in the beginning of the story. But it's when he gets to his family that he says, no, we need to make these actions. We're going to get out of here and we need to find people so we can do something about this. So the very, first act of the story, very reactive. When he gets to his family, that's the climax in my opinion, because that's the moment where he decides whether he is going to fold to this world or whether he is going to follow through at any cost to figure out what the hell is going on. And when his son attacks him as the shapeshifter and he kills the shapeshifter's son and then he leaves the family behind to go find real people, that is when he has made his character choice. He is following through with his motivation, and that is what brings us into the third act. To recap, in my opinion, the first act follows from the introduction to the story up until him escaping the cops. That's when he starts to realize the focus is less on the body and people's reaction to it, to trying to find out the greater conspiracy. We see the climax happens in between the revelation at City Hall and the confrontation with his family. Once he tries to get his family out of there, but he realizes that they're compromised, he makes the final decision to leave without them and to continue looking for people that are not captured. That to me is the character conflict climax. He moves on, and from there we move into the third act, because now he realizes not only does he know what the conspiracy is, so he's had that question, right? The question and the conflict of Act 2, trying to figure out what is the greater conspiracy. He now knows what the conspiracy is. He now knows how far-reaching the conspiracy is. He knows that his family is gone. And so he has accepted that, moved on to Act 3 with the intention to find people to dismantle that. So we move into Act 3. He's escaped from his family. He is continuing to try to get out of town. And he gets to the police commissioner station. He finally thinks that he has someone that he can trust. He lays out his story, his case for what he believes is going on. And, he's met with affirmation. He's met with agreement, essentially. But, of course, we find out, what exactly that entails. So, unfortunately, with this conflict arc, it's not a happy story. And that's part of the reason why it's important to remember that conflicts aren't necessarily a problem and a solution, and the main character always gets to enact that solution. The conflict in this story was, what the hell is going on with the body, and why does no one care about it, right? That's the conflict we were introduced to. So the conflict comes to a resolution when he comes out of the police station. He's brought to the lamppost with the noose, and he becomes the next hanging stranger. We've had the conflict close. We now know why the hanging stranger was there. We now know why no one is reacting. And at this point, we're just seeing the continuing, of the New World Order. So in this particular arc, we had the conflict introduced, what's going on with the body and why don't people react to it, and that arc comes to a close with Ed Loyce becoming the new hanging stranger. And the old world order that we were introduced to at the beginning of the story, where we see Ed Loyce living a normal life. He believes that people are mentally autonomous. He's just doing work in his backyard, has a normal family and everything. That old world comes to a close with the introduction of the conflict, and the new world order is firmly established once the audience recognizes that the conspiracy is real, and not only that, but they're quite successful. They're quite victorious. So just like the beginning, I have a lot less critiques about the conclusion and the introduction as I do with the middle of the story. And again, it's not to say the middle of the story fails in any type of way. They're not super strong criticisms, but the ending, it's not like the biggest mind-blowing twist, I've ever read or ever experienced in a movie or media that I've consumed or anything like that. But I think the reason why I picked this audiobook to discuss with you guys and get into the analysis is because just the idea of, like, what is it? The nail that sticks up, the nail that sticks out is the nail that gets struck down. So it's like that concept of, like, when you're the person that points out how things are wrong, and you're the voice that wants to protest, and you're the one that stands up and says this isn't right, and you're the the man in Tiananmen Square, like when you're the lone wolf of liberty, or of speaking out, or of accountability, or whatever adjective you want to use there, you make yourself a target. And I think there's a really fascinating conversation to be had there, especially as we move into a world with increased electronic surveillance. We have governments and companies that can see everything you do, get into your phone, read your messages, get your contacts, whatever you look up on the internet, it's going to end up in someone else's, ledger, somewhere halfway around the world if they want to pay for that information. So it brings me to these thoughts of, like, where, what happens with humanity in the context of this story, as far as where do we go with electronic surveillance and, obviously, I want to make it clear some aspects of what I'm talking about here are actually, like, really beneficial to us as a society, right? So if someone was planning a terrorist attack, you would want to see that, right? You would want to see their Google searches and things like that. So there comes times when the people that stand out, the people that speak up, the people that want to quote unquote take action, sometimes those are legitimately dangerous to society. Sometimes those are legitimately harmful to the greater good, to the public, societal conscious, and everything like that. But there's also the conversation of if there's an Ed Loyce and there's, whether it's government corruption or whether it's, nepotism, whether it's, there's so many different things, whether it's pedophilia in institutions like the Catholic Church, whether it's, data being hidden, in medical research, whether it's military war crimes that were hidden in military reports, and things like that whistleblowers are putting out. So obviously, whistleblowers have always had a tough time throughout history, and that's its own conversation. But part of the reason why I was saying earlier it's not a perfect parallel, but I feel like themes can be extrapolated out to broader context, is in a way I think of mind control in the same way that media has control over, the music that gets played on the radio, the opinions that get put on the news, and things like that. So it's like, obviously it's not the lack of autonomy that we're talking about in this shapeshifter dystopia. Even still, when you're talking, the idea is if you're the sore thumb, you'll either make yourself stick out or you'll be noticed. So again, not a perfect parallel, but I feel like there's a conversation to be had there in our electronic surveillance. Also, when we're just talking about genetic engineering, we're getting to the point now that we can work with genetic engineering and we can change gene sequences. And we already know that you can breed animals and organisms to get specified traits that you want. And now we can do it on a more localized level with genetic engineering. So when you have Mendel's experiments with the peas and the Punnett squares and everything like that, there is the concern that you run into a situation where it's like, okay, could future dystopian governments create genetic engineered humans or otherwise, create medicines or therapies, gene therapies, whatever it might be, that alter our genetic sequence to the point of being more obedient, to the point where everyone, most people are not like Ed Loyce. Most people are Janet, the wife. Most people are Jimmy, the son. Most people are Jenkins, I think one of the shop owners, right? So they're the other people that a lot of J names in that story, by the way. I just noticed Jimmy, Janet, and Jenkins. Anyway, so what happens when society, civilizations, governments, regimes, companies, whatever it is, can create genetic engineered products or even genetically alter the populace to the point that we're super obedient, that like what happens to an Ed Loyce in the future? What happens there's so many different dystopias we could walk ourselves into where if Ed Loyces are not allowed to exist, it seems very, very difficult to enact social change. And that's basically what the moral of the story was, right? In a lot of ways, obviously, I think the essential moral of the story is, in times of occupation, in times of war, in times of invasion, in times of closed social culture, you have to be careful not to be the sore thumb because you will get snuffed out, and there are almost always consequences of death for that. So I would be curious to see what decade this was made and if it was like post USSR or maybe mid USSR, and what historical events may have been going on that may have prompted some of the themes in this story. But yeah, where do we go when no Ed Loyces can exist? And not just, are encouraged to exist because, I would argue that a lot of governments today, even liberal and democratic governments, don't necessarily like whistleblowers, don't necessarily care for people that speak out. Generally, people in power, no matter how liberal or democratic you are, don't like dissent. So there is a conversation of, even in our modern times, Ed Loyces are not encouraged. They're not really necessarily treated well by a lot of cultures and governments already. But what happens when they can't exist? Right. So that's something to think about. And that was honestly one of the main reasons why I wanted to get into this story in particular, because it is a good story. I did enjoy it. But that topic in particular, that main discussion, the focal point being around like, what do we do in a nonconformist society? How does change happen? What do you do when you notice something that is so obviously wrong? So something so obvious as a body hanging from a lamppost. How many of us would be Ed Loyce? How many of us would speak out, and what would the consequences be? Would we end up like Ed Loyce? Or would we be more like the man on the bus that maybe kept his mouth shut, that noticed that there were people that weren't under the mind control, so to speak, but didn't go out of his way to say, hey, Loyce, I can tell you're one of us. Like he was more covert. And that's the other thing I want to discuss. What are the consequences of people like Ed Loyce? Because the other theme that we need to take from this is a certain level of naive ignorance, right? Because the guy on the bus, I feel like part of the reason why the guy on the bus was included in the story is to show us a certain level of danger of naivete. Because even after he saw the bugs on the city hall, even after he even told his family, he even told Janet, like, they've gotten to everyone but me. How are you going to say that and then also like not realize that your son is like a fly person? You know what I mean? Like that's also part of my deeper criticism with Act 2 is there's certain illogical consistencies. Like I feel like Act 1, a lot of the people acted realistically like what you would expect. And some of Act 2 was just not quite there logically, in my opinion. But he recognizes that all this is going on. He's like, it's everybody but me. But somehow he doesn't see that his family could potentially be under control. And even after he notices that his family is under control, he still doesn't think that maybe the police commissioner is under control from another town. And that's part of the part that, like, that's part of what does, like, kind of blow my mind. And, like, when I do have to criticize the story, is it's like, he goes to the police commissioner and he tells the police commissioner, I think they start at the top. I think they infiltrate at city halls and the police station. So he acknowledges that, like, if they're going to be infiltrated anywhere, they're going to infiltrate the police station first. So why does he tell his conspiracy to the police station first? Like, there are certain things that I'm like, that didn't make sense, dude. So, like, I would love to have a deeper conversation as well about the naivete of Ed Loyce and the consequences of that. And especially the consequences of when he tells the police commissioner about the two people on the bus. And he tells them, he's like, I saw other people. So he's like, he basically ratted them out. Like in a real life situation, that gets people killed. And that's the type of scary stuff, is because in real tyranny, we need to be able to trust each other and able to get out of the darkness. We need to be able to create communities. We need to be able to unify with each other. We need to be able to trust each other. But what tyrannical governments and regimes and horrible institutions do well is they promote distrust and disunity, because it is the easiest way to make other people, one, question if it's even worth it, question if they can trust the people that they need to align themselves with to group up to do something about it. There's a great quote that I really love, which basically says, never doubt that a small group of motivated people can change the world, because that is the only thing that ever has. Right? So powerful people that have nefarious intentions, they understand the ability of distrust and disunity, and to promote that within the communities that you wish to control. So I think Ed Loyce's, like it should be talked about that one of Ed Loyce's biggest mistakes, I think, was, not just going to police commission, not just failing to foresee that his family could have been captured, but ratting out the other people. So because you can't blame him for being naive and talking about the body and being like, what's going on, guys? Like he didn't know things were wacky at that point. I don't blame him for that. But it's like, by the time he gets to like his family, he kind of makes some poor choices. So, there's probably a lot that can be extrapolated from the story. I would totally love to hear the opinions and perspectives from you guys, because I'm sure there's plenty that you guys see that I missed. I really enjoyed doing this summary. I hope it was engaging and made you want to check out the story. Like I said, I'll put a link in the description, so that way you guys can listen to the same audio version that I listen to. I'm always looking for feedback, so if you guys have more stories, any audiobooks, they can be fiction, nonfiction, and even any medium. It doesn't have to be rhetorical mediums. If you guys have video games, movies, like if there's anything, I'm open to checking all types of stuff out. I love getting wisdom from any source that I can, getting entertainment from any source that I can. We are not monolithic creatures in our minds and our cultures and our outlooks and our perspectives. So I would love to get feedback from you guys. I would love to do more of these. And I also want to come back and maybe revisit this in the future. There might be some value in maybe waiting a year or two, coming back and seeing if my thoughts have changed on this. Maybe there will be things that have gone on in the world that will add new perspectives to the story. Things that go on in my life, just personal things that might change some of my perspectives. Maybe some feedback that you guys give me, some perspectives, some opinions, things you notice from the story that I didn't, that allow me to look at things deeper. So maybe we'll come back to this at another time. As I said, I would love to do more. Always looking for feedback from you guys and finding new things to check out. So thank you guys again for listening. I can't wait to do more of these, and I can't wait to be introduced to more sources of wisdom, more stories for entertainment, more perspectives and opinions, and everything like that. Thank you guys for sticking around. I really appreciate it, and I can't wait to speak to you guys again soon. Thank you again for listening to the Weis Choice Podcast. Take care.